She was born into privilege, but refused to live by its rules. Before the world called her the people's princess, she was simply a young woman with questions too bold for the halls of British aristocracy. And those questions would change history. The rain that morning fell in a thin silver veil over the Sandringham estate, turning the manicured gardens into a mirror of the gray English sky. Inside Park House, a sprawling, slightly drafty home that belonged to the Spencer family, a young Diana Frances Spencer pressed her forehead to the cool glass of her bedroom window. She was 10 years old, her breath fogging the pain as she watched the gardeners in their heavy coats move like slow shadows across the lawn. It was supposed to be another ordinary day, but Diana's life had already begun to crack in ways most children never see. Her parents' marriage was unraveling, loudly, painfully, and in the full view of servants and siblings. Arguments echoed through the house like thunder, the kind you couldn't hide from no matter how many doors you closed. Her mother, Frances, was elegant but restless. Her father, Johnny Spencer, a traditional man of the old English gentry. Between them lay a battlefield of unspoken disappointments. To the outside world, Diana was a Spencer, part of a lineage steeped in centuries of aristocratic prestige, connected to the very roots of British nobility. But behind the oak-paneled doors, she was a little girl who often felt invisible. She had learned early that appearances were everything in this world. Smiles for guests, silence during the dinners, and an unshakable posture that concealed the tremor inside. Curiosity gap. Even as a child, she wondered why people pretended so much. Why her mother's eyes could sparkle for visitors and turn to glass when the door closed. Why rules about what is done seemed to matter more than kindness. She didn't know it yet, but those questions, dangerous in circles she was born into, would one day make her both adored and hunted. At school, she was shy, even awkward. Her long legs carried her too fast through hallways she never felt she belonged in. Teachers noted her compassion, the way she lingered to help younger girls tie their shoelaces, or how she listened when someone cried. She was never the best in academics, but she shone in sports and dance, in places where the heart mattered more than the mind. By her teenage years, she had built an inner world far from the formality of her upbringing, filled with pop music, romance novels, and daydreams of a life that felt real. And yet, every summer and Christmas, she was drawn back into the orbit of the royal family. The Spencers had long-standing ties with the Windsors. The young Diana grew up knowing that somewhere behind the gilded gates of Buckingham Palace lived a family whose rules made her own seem tame. It was at one of those gatherings in the late summer of 1977 that fate quietly opened the first door. Diana, then just 16, was invited to a weekend at Althorpe House. Among the guests was a man she'd seen only in photographs, Charles, Prince of Wales. He was 29, reserved, and every inch the image of royal composure. But he wasn't there for her. He was courting her older sister, Sarah. Still, there was something in the way he spoke to Diana, a flicker of curiosity in his otherwise measured gaze. She was unpolished compared to the women he usually met. She laughed too easily, spoke without the layers of guardedness expected in his world. That weekend, their conversations were brief but left a trace, something both would remember, though neither could guess why. From that moment on, Diana's life began to slow. Quiet turn toward the center of the stage she didn't even know she was walking onto. In a few short years, the girl who loved pop songs and ballet would be thrust under the brightest and harshest spotlight in the world. But before the cameras, before the headlines, there was a story of a young woman trying to understand who she really was and how much of herself she was willing to give away. The wind that evening pressed against the old windows of Park House, rattling the frames as if to remind her that change was coming. Diana sat at her desk, scribbling in a diary she would later hide under her bed. One day, she wrote, "I will do something that matters." She didn't know the cost of that promise. Not yet. The quiet courtship. The years between that weekend at Althorpe and the moment the world learned her name were filled with quiet, almost imperceptible shifts in Diana's life. She finished school, worked as a nanny, and took a flat in London with a few friends, a modest life by aristocratic standards, but one that gave her a rare taste of freedom. It was during this time, in the late winter of 1980, that the telephone rang in her small London apartment. One of her flatmates called out that the Prince of Wales was on the line. At first, Diana laughed, thinking it was a prank. But the voice that came through was unmistakable, warm but measured, asking if she might join him for an evening at Buckingham Palace. That night, she dressed simply, resisting the temptation to look overly polished. When the palace doors opened to her, she felt the weight of history in every corridor. Portraits of monarchs staring down at her with the kind of judgment only oil paint can hold. Charles was gracious, even a little shy. They talked about music, about the countryside, about how lonely life could be in a crowd. She left that night without knowing what it meant, but sensing that a small door had opened again. Over the next few months, they saw each other in private, their meetings shielded from the public eye. In the car rides between engagements, Diana noticed how often Charles spoke of duty, of tradition, of the crown's expectations. She listened more than she spoke, though she couldn't help but wonder where love fit into all of this. London in those days was a city caught between eras, the remnants of a reserved Britain brushing against a new, freer generation. Diana lived in both worlds at once. In the mornings, she worked at the Young England kindergarten, laughing with children who had no idea they were in the presence of a woman soon to be etched into history books. In the evenings, she might be whisked away to a quiet dinner with the prince, or left alone to wash dishes while her friends went out dancing. By the summer of 1980, whispers had begun. Photographers loitered near her flat, and neighbors traded stories in hushed tones. A young woman seen with the heir to the throne could not remain anonymous for long. Yet even then, Diana tried to hold on to the small rituals that kept her grounded, buying flowers from the corner shop, taking long walks in Hyde Park, writing letters she would never send. It was in those walks that she often wrestled with a thought she could not shake, that her life was changing faster than she could prepare for it. She knew the world of the royals from the outside, the glittering events, the formalities, the endless rules, but stepping inside would mean surrendering parts of herself she wasn't ready to lose. Still, when Charles invited her to Balmoral, the royal family's Scottish estate, she accepted. It was a test of sorts, an unspoken audition to see if she could fit within the intricate machinery of the monarchy. The sprawling landscapes of the Scottish Highlands were breathtaking, but the walls inside Balmoral carried their own kind of chill. Every gesture, every word was observed, weighed, and measured. Diana smiled, laughed at the right moments, charmed the queen with her warmth, and even joined in the muddy walks through the hills. She passed the test. By the time she returned to London, the decision had been made, though not entirely by her. The press began to swarm. Headlines speculated about engagement, and Diana's days of anonymity evaporated. She found herself glancing out of windows before stepping outside, knowing a camera lens might be waiting. Friends noticed a change in her, not in spirit, but in the way she moved, as if a curtain had been drawn between her and the rest of the world. One evening, in the soft light of her apartment, she sat cross-legged on her bed, a phone in one hand and a letter in the other. The letter was from her sister, warning her not to rush, reminding her that life within the palace was not a fairy tale. The phone rang again. This time, when she answered, it was Charles. His voice was steady, deliberate. "I think it's time," he said. Diana didn't respond right away. She stared out into the London night, the hum of the city seeping through her window. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that time meant more than an engagement. It meant a life forever bound to crown, to its weight, to its demands. And yet, she said yes. The crown and the cage. The winter of 1981 settled over London with a damp, heavy chill, but the city's streets pulsed with something electric. It was on February 24th, in the grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace, that the announcement was finally made. Lady Diana Spencer was engaged to Charles, Prince of Wales. The news raced through newspapers, television screens, and radios like a spark through dry grass. Overnight, she was transformed from a shy young kindergarten teacher into the future Queen of England. The ring, an oval sapphire surrounded by 14 diamonds, was dazzling under the camera's glare. But Diana's smile, though luminous, was marked by the faint stiffness of someone who understood the enormity of what was happening but hadn't yet absorbed its consequences. As she stood beside Charles, answering questions for press, one reporter asked if they were in love. Charles replied, "Whatever in love means," and though it was brushed off as a curious remark, the words lingered in the air like an omen no one wanted to read. From that moment, Diana's life was no longer her own. The press coverage was relentless. Paparazzi staked out her home day and night, shouting questions, their camera flashes burning her eyes. She learned to smile through it, to step from her car with practiced grace, to let the endless clicking of shutters become a kind of background noise. But at night, when the apartment was quiet, she would sit in the dark and feel the walls closing in. The wedding preparations were a spectacle in themselves. Designers competed for the honor of creating her dress, and the streets buzzed with speculation about every detail. The chosen gown, ivory silk taffeta, a 25-foot train, and antique lace, was a masterpiece of fantasy. Yet for Diana, the fittings were less about dreams and more about performance. Every stitch felt like a stitch in the fabric of the role she was about to play. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, she moved into Clarence's house to be closer to the palace, a transition that felt like stepping onto a stage she couldn't exit. The courtiers, with their centuries-old protocols, watched her carefully. Every word, every gesture was weighed. She was taught how to greet foreign dignitaries, how to curtsy to the queen, how to wear hats so they wouldn't cast unflattering shadows under camera lights. The lessons were endless, and so were the eyes upon her. Behind the scenes, she began to notice the small fractures. Charles's schedule was often filled with engagements she wasn't invited to. Late-night phone calls ended abruptly when she entered the room. Whispers about Camilla Parker Bowles, a name she'd been told was just a friend, drifted toward her like smoke she couldn't quite see but could smell everywhere. Still, the world expected a fairy tale, and on July 29, 1981, they got one. Over 750 million people across the globe tuned in to watch her walk down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral. The bells rang, the choirs sang, and her dress seemed to carry its own light as she moved toward the altar. Charles waited in his naval uniform, every detail flawless, every moment choreographed. As she spoke her vows, her voice trembled slightly, not from fear of the crowd, but from the weight of the promises she was making. Outside, the streets erupted in celebration. Inside, she felt the surreal stillness of a life being sealed in gold and glass. That night, as the couple appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, the crowd roared. The kiss, brief, shy, was immortalized in photographs that would be printed on posters, mugs, and commemorative plates. It was the image of a perfect beginning. But in the quiet hours after the celebrations ended, Diana sat in her new home at Kensington Palace and looked around at the opulence. The ceilings were high, the walls adorned with centuries-old portraits, the rooms filled with antiques worth more than most houses. And yet, the air felt cold. The space felt too large for her voice to fill. She had married not just a man, but an institution. And in that moment, she realized the crown was not just a symbol of power. It was also a cage. The smile for the cameras. The honeymoon began with a yacht, the Britannia, gliding through the Mediterranean, its white hull slicing across the blue waters under a sun so bright it seemed determined to bleach every shadow away. To the public, the images were a dream. Diana in pastel sundresses, her hair catching the wind, Charles at her side in light linen shirts. Every photograph sold the story the world wanted to believe, that the fairy tale was unfolding exactly as written. But between those flashes of perfection, Diana began to notice the silences. They would sit together at breakfast, the sea shimmering outside the wide windows, yet conversation would drift into formality. Charles spoke often of his schedule, of letters he needed to answer, of the charities and duties waiting for him back in London. And always, somewhere in his words, there was a trace of someone else. Camilla's name was never said aloud, but Diana could feel it, like a third presence in the room, invisible but impossible to ignore. They visited the Greek islands, their days filled with official appearances, even on what was meant to be a private holiday. Diana was expected to be radiant, charming, and endlessly patient. She smiled for photographs, waved from a yacht's deck, and learned to hold her head at just the right angle so the sunlight would catch her sapphire engagement ring. It was a performance she gave flawlessly, even as something inside her began to tighten. When they returned to Britain, the royal duties began immediately. Their first official tour was to Wales, where thousands lined the streets, waving flags and shouting her name. The roar of the crowd was intoxicating and overwhelming all at once. Diana could feel their warmth, their genuine love for her, but she also saw the hunger in the press photographers, a hunger that wasn't just for her smile, but for any flicker of weakness they could exploit. At first, she tried to navigate the palace life with optimism. She decorated her rooms at Kensington Palace in softer colors, surrounding herself with flowers and photographs of her family. She poured herself into her work, visiting hospitals, meeting children, supporting charities. Her empathy, raw and unfiltered, was unlike anything the monarchy had seen in decades. People didn't just admire her, they connected to her. But that connection came with a cost. The media began to crown her the star of the royal family, sometimes at Charles's expense. Headlines compared their charisma, their popularity, even their smiles. Diana could feel the subtle tension, in the way Charles's jaw tightened when the crowds chanted her name louder than his, in the way conversations at the palace shifted when she entered a room. The marriage began to feel like two separate performances on the same stage. Charles kept his duties, often disappearing for days on engagements or retreats. Diana, left alone, would wander the halls of Kensington Palace, a place beautiful enough to impress the world, but echoing with loneliness in the quiet hours. She was only 20 years old, and yet her life had already been narrowed to a path that left little room to breathe. The pressure to be perfect became relentless. Every outfit was dissected in the press, every glance analyzed. A misstep on a staircase became tabloid fodder. A moment of fatigue was spun into speculation about her health. Diana began to feel as if she was living under a glass dome, every move magnified, every imperfection broadcast. It was during this time that she began to struggle with something she could barely name, a deep unease with her body, her reflection. The stress, the isolation, and the constant scrutiny began to chip away at her sense of self. Meals became a battleground. Her weight fluctuated as she quietly developed bulimia, a disorder she would later speak about openly to the world. But in 1981, it was a secret she carried alone. One evening, after yet another public event, Diana stood before her mirror, still in her evening gown. The jewels at her throat sparkled under the soft light, but her eyes were tired, shadowed. She reached up, unclasped the necklace, and let it fall into her hand. It felt heavy, not from its gold and stones, but from what it represented. She thought of her old life, the small London flat, the mornings at the kindergarten, the sound of children's laughter. That world felt so far away it might as well have belonged to someone else. The turning point came on an official trip to Australia and New Zealand in 1983. It was supposed to be another test, to see if the young princess could endure weeks of constant appearances, speeches, and ceremonies. From the moment they arrived, the crowd surged toward her, sometimes breaking through barriers just to shake her hand. She greeted each person as if they were the only one in the world, bending down to meet children at their eye level, speaking with warmth that no protocol book could teach. By the end of the tour, the world wasn't just in love with the idea of Princess Diana. They were in love with her, and the palace noticed. When they returned home, Diana realized something profound. The monarchy might own her schedule, her image, and even her privacy, but they could not control the bond she had with the public. That connection was hers alone, and it might one day be her only weapon in a life where nearly everything else had been taken. And so, the smile for the cameras became something new, not just a mask, but a shield. The third shadow. The shift was subtle at first, the kind of change you only notice when you look back and realize it's been there all along. For Diana, it was in the way Charles's gaze would drift when certain names came up in conversation, in the way his mood could darken suddenly, as if a cloud had passed over him, and most of all in the phone calls. They were short, coded, and always followed by a certain quiet that seemed heavier than silence. By the mid-1980s, Diana had learned what the palace already knew. Camilla Parker Bowles was not just a friend. The realization was less a sudden blow than a slow, aching awareness, the kind that seeps into you over weeks and months. She remembered moments from before the wedding, the hurried explanations, the knowing glances between courtiers, and felt the threads pulling together into a pattern she couldn't ignore. The public, of course, saw none of this. They saw the radiant princess stepping out of cars in shimmering gowns, shaking hands with dignitaries, embracing sick children with a tenderness that seemed to brighten the very room she entered. But behind palace walls, her marriage was becoming a performance played for the benefit of the cameras. Diana began to retreat into herself. The walls of Kensington Palace, once merely cold, now felt suffocating. Nights were the hardest. She would lie awake listening to the clock ticking the dark, each sound a reminder that time was moving forward, but her life was standing still. Her work became her escape. She threw herself into her charitable engagements with a passion that surprised even her. Hospitals, AIDS wards, homeless shelters, places the royal family rarely ventured, became her refuge. There, she was not the future queen or the wife of the heir. She was simply Diana. She could kneel by a child's bed, take an old man's hand, and be entirely present in the moment. It was on one of those visits, holding the hand of a young AIDS patient, that she decided she would no longer let the palace dictate every part of her life. She began to speak more openly, to connect more deeply with people, even if it meant stepping outside the carefully drawn lines of royal protocol. And each time she did, her popularity soared. That popularity was a double-edged sword. The more the public adored her, the more tension grew between her and Charles. At state dinners, their conversations became stilted. On tours, their body language told a story the press was quick to photograph. A glance away, a space between them, a smile that didn't reach the eyes. In 1986, the cracks widened into chasms. Charles resumed his relationship with Camilla openly enough that it no longer required whispered rumors. Diana confronted him in private, a storm of hurt and betrayal that left both of them speaking through clenched teeth for days. It was in one of those arguments that Charles said words she would never forget. You knew what you were getting into. She hadn't. From that point on, she began to live a kind of double life. In public, she perfected the art of composure, the graceful wave, the gentle smile, the eyes that could hide their storms. In private, she sought solace in friends, in her sons William and Harry, and in the small moments of joy that palace life couldn't touch. William was born in 1982, Harry in 1984. Motherhood became her anchor, her reason to keep going. She was determined that her boys would know a different kind of childhood than she had, one filled with affection, laughter, and a sense of normality wherever possible. She would sneak them into McDonald's, take them to amusement parks, let them play in the mud without worrying about protocol. In those moments, she felt more like herself than at any royal banquet. But the shadows in her marriage only grew longer. The tabloids, once her adoring chorus, began to sniff out the strain. Headlines hinted at trouble in paradise. Photographers became more aggressive, chasing her car through London streets, shouting invasive questions. She could handle the attention. She had learned how. But when they turned their lenses on her children, a new kind of fury burned in her. One autumn evening, after returning from an engagement, she stood on the balcony of Kensington Palace. The city stretched out below her, the lights glittering like scattered jewels. She thought about the girl she had been, the one who had pressed her forehead to the cold glass of Park House windows, and promised herself she would do something that mattered. She had kept that promise, but at a cost she could never have imagined. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the palace gates, flashbulbs popped. They were always there now, waiting, watching, ready to catch the moment when the princess's smile faltered. And Diana knew one day she might let them see. Taking back the spotlight. By the early 1990s, Diana's marriage to the Prince of Wales had shifted from strained to fractured, though the palace still clung to the illusion of unity. For the cameras, they walked side by side. For the public, They smiled when duty demanded it, but behind closed doors, the distance between them had become an unbridgeable gulf. For Diana, the isolation had sharpened into clarity. She began to see the monarchy not as a family, but as a fortress, one that expected silence and obedience from those within its walls. But she also realized something else. The fortress had a weakness. It needed the love of the people to stand, and the people loved her. She started to step into her own power, consciously crafting her public appearances to communicate more than the palace intended. A glance, a choice of dress, a lingering moment with someone in a crowd. Each became a statement. The palace could control her itinerary, but not the connection she built with those who came to see her. The media, always hungry, noticed a shift. They began to follow her not just because she was a princess, but because she was unpredictable. At a charity gala, she wore a striking black off-the-shoulder gown, a daring choice in royal terms, and walked into the room as if she owned it. The press would call it the revenge dress, though the reason wouldn't be clear until hours later, when a television interview aired in which Charles admitted to his affair with Camilla. Diana didn't have to say a word. Her appearance that night said everything. Her work became more pointed. She championed causes the royal family had largely ignored. AIDS awareness, homelessness, the removal of landmines in war zones. She refused to wear gloves when meeting patients, choosing instead to take their hands in her own. It was more than compassion. It was defiance. She was telling the world that the people society shunned were worthy of dignity and touch. Each act of empathy deepened her bond with the public, and each bond tightened her grip on the very spotlight the monarchy once used to control her. The tabloids could be cruel, but they could not deny her magnetism. Even their most critical headlines sold copies when her face was on the cover. Charles, meanwhile, withdrew further into his own circle. The tension between them became so visible that even the most loyal palace courtiers could not pretend it away. At public events, they were often seen standing apart, their interactions clipped and formal. It was no longer a whisper. It was a visible fracture. In 1992, the inevitable came. Prime Minister John Major announced to Parliament that Charles and Diana had agreed to separate. The marriage was over in all but name, and yet Diana remained firmly in the public eye. The palace had hoped her role would shrink without the marriage. Instead, she became an even larger figure on the global stage, her schedule filled with trips abroad, not the ceremonial ribbon-cutting tours of old, but missions that took her into hospitals, refugee camps, and minefields. In Angola, she walked across a recently cleared minefield wearing a protective vest and face shield. The image captured by photographers and broadcast around the world. It wasn't just an act of charity. It was a declaration that her life's work would be defined on her terms, not the palace's. Still, the pressure was relentless. The paparazzi swarmed her everywhere, their motorcycles weaving dangerously through traffic as they chased her car. Each outing required strategy, decoy vehicles, sudden changes of route, the constant calculation of where a camera might appear. Privacy had become a memory, and safety a fragile hope. Through it all, she clung to her role as a mother. William and Harry were her anchor in the chaos, the part of her life that reminded her she was more than a headline. She fought for time with them, for the right to make their lives as normal as possible. She took them skiing, to amusement parks, on school runs, moment of ordinary joy in an extraordinary life. One night, after putting the boys to bed at Kensington Palace, she stood in the quiet hallway outside their rooms. The only sounds were the faint hum of the heating and the distant rumble of the city. She thought about everything she had endured, the betrayals, the battles, the endless scrutiny, and realized something unshakable. She was still standing. The crown had tried to define her. The marriage had tried to contain her. The press had tried to own her. But in the end, Diana had become something none of them could control. Life after the palace. The official divorce came on August 28, 1996. The settlement stripped her of the title Her Royal Highness, but allowed her to keep the title Princess of Wales. For Diana, it was more than a change in how people addressed her. It was a final severing of a life she had once been told was her destiny. The day the papers were signed, she walked out of Kensington Palace for a charity meeting wearing a pale blue suit, head held high. If she was grieving, she did not let the world see it. Her freedom, however, was complicated. Without the constraints of the palace, she could choose her own causes, her own schedule, even her own friends. But the press, freed from any remaining restraint, descended on her with ferocity she had never experienced before. Each move was cataloged, each relationship dissected, each rumor amplified until it filled front pages across the world. Diana decided to double down on the part of her life she could control, her humanitarian work. She became more deliberate about the issues she championed, choosing causes that were controversial, urgent, and deeply human. Landmine clearance, AIDS awareness, leprosy treatment, and child welfare programs became her focus. She traveled to Bosnia, Angola, India, not to attend state banquets, but to kneel in the dust with survivors, to walk through hospital wards, to sit with mothers who had lost everything to war. Her empathy wasn't performative. In Angola, when she walked through a recently cleared minefield, the cameras caught more than a princess in protective gear. They caught a woman who had decided that her image, once controlled by others, would now be her most powerful weapon for change. Governments that had ignored the issue suddenly faced public pressure. The world took notice. Away from her charity work, Diana's personal life was a constant storm. She was linked to friends, acquaintances, and public figures, each rumor feeding the tabloids' endless appetite. But the most public relationship was with Dodi Fayed, the son of billionaire Mohammed Al-Fayed. It began in the summer of 1997, when she accepted an invitation to join the Fayed family on their yacht in the Mediterranean. The photographs of them together, laughing on deck, swimming in the turquoise waters, lounging under the sun, were splashed across newspapers worldwide. For some, it was a scandal. For others, it was a romantic escape. For Diana, it was simply a rare stretch of days where she could breathe, away from the cold corridors of the palace and the endless formalities of her former life. Yet even in those fleeting moments of peace, the shadow of the press was never far. The paparazzi followed them from port to port, chartering boats to get closer, using telephoto lenses to catch every glance, every touch. Diana had long since learned to live with their presence, but in these weeks, their aggression seemed to sharpen into something more dangerous. Back in London, she tried to maintain a routine with William and Harry. She took them to school, to football matches, to the cinema, trying to carve out a sense of normality in lives that were anything but normal. She wanted them to see her as their mother first, not as a figure the world obsessed over. Still, the weight of constant attention never truly lifted. Security was an ever-present concern. Every car ride came with the awareness of being followed. Every dinner out meant flashes exploding in her face. She often told friends she felt hunted. In the final weeks of her life, she confided to journalists that she was entering a new chapter. She spoke about wanting to focus more deeply on her humanitarian work, about possibly moving abroad for a time, about building a life on her own terms. There was a lightness in her voice when she spoke of the future, as if she believed, perhaps for the first time, that she could outrun the machinery that had tried to define her. But the machinery was faster. That summer of 1997, the Mediterranean sun glinted off the waters as she boarded Dodi's yacht once more. The images were serene, even joyful. What no one could see was how quickly those golden days were closing toward a night in Paris that would change everything. In the crowded streets and flashing lights of that city, the line between fame and danger would blur until it was gone. The night the world stopped. Paris was alive that night, August 31st, 1997. Its streets glowing under a soft drizzle, the kind of rain that made every street lamp halo in the dark. The Ritz Hotel shimmered in gold light, its entrance lined with photographers who had been waiting for hours. Inside, in the imperial suite, Diana sat on the edge of a sofa, her hands loosely clasped in her lap. She was wearing a black sleeveless dress, simple yet elegant, the kind of outfit she chose when she wanted to feel like herself, not a headline. Dodi was pacing, speaking quietly with their security team. The plan had been to slip out unnoticed, to spend the night at his Paris apartment. But already, the paparazzi had the scent. Dozens of them gathered outside, engines idling, ready to follow. For years, Diana had lived with this, the hum pursuit always somewhere behind her. But tonight, it felt heavier, faster. When they finally stepped into the hotel's rear exit, the night air was cool, thick with the smell of wet asphalt. Henri Paul, the hotel security officer, was at the wheel of the black Mercedes. They slid into the back seat, Dodie beside her, bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones in the front. The car pulled into the street, headlights slicing through the drizzle. Almost immediately, the swarm followed, scooters, motorcycles, cars weaving dangerously through traffic. The flash of cameras exploded in the darkness, each burst like lightning striking too close. The Mercedes accelerated. Inside, Diana turned toward the window, watching the lights of Paris blur into streaks. She had spoken of a new chapter, of a future she could finally shape herself. In those moments, she might have been thinking about her boys, William and Harry, sleeping far away in England, unaware that the world around them was about to change forever. The chase tightened through the streets, engines roaring, tires hissing on wet pavement. The entrance to the Pont de El Alma tunnel appeared ahead, a yawning mouth of darkness. The Mercedes entered at high speed. In the next seconds, time collapsed, a sound like the tearing of the world itself. Metal folding in on metal, the shattering of glass. Then silence. The wreckage lay crumpled against a concrete pillar inside the tunnel, its black paint glistening under the sodium lights. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, closer. Paparazzi, still clicking their shutters, crowded near the scene, their lenses aimed at the broken frame of the car. Some would later claim they were trying to help. Others would admit the truth. They were still chasing the photograph. Emergency crews reached the wreck within minutes. Dodie was gone instantly. Henri Paul lay motionless. In the back seat, Diana was still alive, her pulse faint, her breathing shallow. The paramedics worked quickly, lifting her carefully from the wreckage. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting against injuries too severe to see. At 4 a.m., at Piti-Salpêtrière Hospital, the fight ended. Diana, Princess of Wales, was gone. She was 36 years old. The news broke across the globe like a sudden storm. Radios interrupted their broadcasts. Television anchors spoke with voices that trembled. In London, people poured into the streets, some in disbelief, others already in tears. Outside Kensington Palace, flowers began to appear, a single bouquet at first, then dozens, then hundreds, until the gates vanished behind a wall of blooms, cards, candles, and handwritten notes. The days that followed felt unreal. Britain, a nation known for its reserve, wept openly. People who had never met her spoke of her as if they had lost a sister, a daughter, a friend. Her warmth, her defiance, her willingness to touch the untouchable, these had made her more than a princess. She was theirs. The funeral procession moved through the streets of London beneath a gray September sky. William and Harry walked behind her coffin, their faces set in the kind of composure that no child should have to learn. The world watched, millions lining the route, billions more through television screens. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of horses' hooves and the distant sobs of strangers. When the service ended, when the final prayers were spoken, her coffin was carried to the Spencer family estate in Althorpe. There, on a small island in the middle of a quiet lake, she was laid to rest. The water reflected the clouds above, and the wind moved gently through the trees. Her story did not end there. It lived on in the faces of her sons, in the causes she had championed, in the millions who carried a piece of her memory, and in the questions that lingered about fame, about love, about the cost of living a life under the relentless gaze of the world. That night in Paris took her life, but it also froze her in time, forever young, forever luminous, forever the woman who dared to be more than the role she was given. And for those who loved her, whether they knew her or only knew of her, there was one truth they could never forget. Diana didn't just live in the world. She changed it. Asterisk, some stories fade with time, but hers will never dim. Diana taught us that compassion is strength, that kindness can defy tradition, and that even in the harshest spotlight, you can still choose to shine. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother, and for millions, a voice they didn't know they needed. Her life was a reminder that the most powerful crowns are not made of gold, but of love. If her journey moved you, if her courage inspired you, join us here. This channel is where we honor the silent heroes, the hidden battles, and the truths too often left untold. Subscribe, share her story, and keep her legacy alive. Because as long as we remember, she's never truly gone. Asterisk,